Good evening again, and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, we are in the middle of a verse-by-verse study on Matthew 24, and we are in the middle of, literally, of verse 30. And we are looking at the phrase, "Then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn." And in the last video, we looked at one of the prophetic sources of that phrase, which is Zechariah 12, verse 10. I want to take another look at that text, Zechariah 12:10, and pull out a few more things that helps us to identify, once again, that mourning was the mourning of all 12 tribes of Israel who were situated in Judah and Jerusalem at the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So go with me to Zechariah 12:10. We're going to read 10 and 11, and then we'll share some thoughts from there. Zechariah 12:10. "I will pour out on the house of Judah and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day," verse 11, so in that day, the day when the spirit of grace and supplication was poured out upon Judah and Jerusalem, that was Pentecost, in the day that they would pierce him who comes on the clouds of heaven, that was Revelation 1:7, Matthew 24:30 and 34, that was in the first century generation. And in the day when they would look upon him whom they had pierced. John says they looked upon him whom they pierced in 30 AD at the crucifixion. John 19:37, the Gospel of John. Nonetheless, in that day, watch this, there will be great mourning in Jerusalem. Okay? So once again, this identifies the mourning in Matthew 24:30 as a national mourning in Jerusalem. But watch this. That mourning would be like the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. So, in order to understand what this first century mourning was like of Matthew 24:30, we have to understand what the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo was like. So let's do this. And to do this, I want to go to the commentary, a commentary by John Peter Lang on Zechariah 12 verse 11, and I want to share some insight that he has on this text and see if we can pull out something that we've already looked at but ties together with Matthew 24:30 as well. Watch this. This is what he says concerning the mourning at Hadad-rimmon. The prophet furnishes, that is Zechariah, furnishes a historical illustration of the greatness of the mourning. The reference is generally supposed to be the lamentation over Josiah, who was mortally wounded in the valley of Megiddo. And you can find that in 2 Chronicles 35 in verse 22 and following. Hadad-rimmon appears to have been a city in this valley. So Hadad-rimmon was a city in the valley of Megiddo. Now watch this. This is what he says again. "He was slain on the account of the sins of the people. His reign was the closing manifestation of the mercy on the part of the Lord. Unspeakable misery followed immediately afterwards. The lamentation for his death rested upon the mingled feelings of love and of sorrow for their own sins as the cause of his death." Now, King Josiah was the last righteous king of Judah, of Jerusalem. And his death was in this plain in the valley of Megiddo. But here's the incredible thing about this. His death came at the hands of King Necho, or Necho of Egypt. Okay? Now, here's what Zechariah says. This mourning in Jerusalem at the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 would be like the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. But that mourning in Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo was the mourning over a righteous king, King Josiah, who had died at the hands of the Egyptians. Now, remember what we've already established in Matthew 24. When Jesus spoke those symbolic, metaphorical words, "The sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not shed its light, and the stars will fall from heaven." He quoted, one of his quotations was Ezekiel 32:7 and 8. And in that text, Ezekiel was prophesying the judgment of Egypt at the hands of the Babylonians. We showed you from that text that Jesus was not only prophesying the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, but he was identifying that nation, that is Old Covenant Israel, as spiritual Egypt. And that is verified in Revelation 11:8. Jerusalem, the city that killed, where the Lord was slain, is spiritual Sodom and Egypt. Jesus is saying once again in Matthew 24:30, by quoting Zechariah 12 verse 10, where Zechariah says the mourning in Jerusalem in that day would be like the mourning in Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. And that mourning was the mourning over a righteous king who was slaughtered by the Egyptians. Jesus is telling his audience that their mourning, the mourning of all tribes of the land of Israel, would be like the mourning over a righteous king who was killed by the Egyptians. That's exactly what took place in 30 AD. Those who they had pierced was their Messiah. Spiritual Egypt had killed their king. They had killed their own king. They had killed their Messiah. And that mourning in AD 70 was the mourning over an only son. And it was like the mourning over the righteous King Josiah, who the Egyptians slew. That's powerful. That's exactly the themes and the framework of Matthew 24:30. It was like the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. And let me show you one more thing from Zechariah. Notice this in verse 12 and 13. The land will mourn. That's the land of Jerusalem. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself. By themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by themselves, and their wives by themselves, etc. Now, there's two families here identified: the house of David, the family of David, and the house of Levi and the family of Levi. Listen, this speaks of kingship, of kingdom, and priesthood. Those who would mourn they would mourn over the loss of their kingdom, the loss of their priesthood. Now, I'm just sharing some thoughts, but that's what I see here. They would mourn. That is, the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of David would mourn over their loss of their kingdom. When Jerusalem would be destroyed, that was the end of their aspirations for a physical, literal kingdom, where the physical descendant of David would sit upon the throne in Jerusalem. That was over. The house of David, the family of David, would mourn. That kingdom aspiration of a physical kingdom would be annihilated. And the house of Levi would mourn. Why? Because the temple was destroyed. Their idea of a renewed, purified Levitical priesthood to offer service in a restored most holy place with the Ark of a Covenant was destroyed. That idea, that aspiration was destroyed. The idea of a kingship and the idea of a priesthood fell with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And those families, those houses that represented that aspiration mourned at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. It was those who pierced him. It was for those aspirations that they pierced him. They didn't want his kingdom. They wanted their kingdom. They wanted the old covenant kingdom. And because they refused to receive the new covenant manifestation of the kingdom of Jesus Christ and his priesthood, they pierced him. And when they recognized this, at the fall of their city and their covenant world, all tribes of the earth mourn. And the kingdom, they mourn for their kingdom. The loss of their kingdom, they mourn for the loss of their priesthood. And that mourning was like the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the valley of Megiddo. They mourned over a righteous king who they, spiritual Egypt, had slew. Well, I hope that made sense, and it makes sense to me in my head, but something you can dig into further in your studies. So we'll pick it up next time. We will look at the second of the prophetic sources of Matthew 24:30, and Jesus' phrase, all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.